Good day. Firstly, a brief word of explanation. I was supposed to be out of London today, but the business trip that I'd scheduled for yesterday was postponed by the other party until today. So that has given me a time to make a brief video, and I'm afraid it's going to have to be very brief because I'm going to be travelling soon. Having said which, it's also fair to say that the events which have taken place over the last few hours can also be summarized very quickly, which is what makes making a video worthwhile. Firstly, over the course of yesterday, both the Russians and the Ukrainians confirmed that the Russians are now in complete control of the entirety of Severodonetsk. The Ukrainian resistance at the Azot chemical factory has collapsed, and it's not just the case that Severodonetsk itself has fallen entirely under Russian control, but it seems that the Russians are now in control of the entire right bank or eastern bank of the Seversky Donetsk river. The Ukrainians are still clinging on to Lysychansk, but apparently there are now increasing problems using the main roads to Lysychansk, and an attempt by Ukrainian troops to leave Lysychansk, either to withdraw or to attack Russian forces to the west of the city, ended in disaster, with the Ukrainian column caught in open country by Russian artillery and helicopter gunships and suffering massive losses. Now, the number of Ukrainian troops still holed up in Lysychansk is, of course, always the topic of controversy. Some figures put it at around 7,000 to 8,000, and I'm going to stick with that figure for the moment. No doubt in time we will learn more accurately how many troops the Ukrainians actually do have in Lysychansk. And it's been suggested that the Ukrainians would now find it very difficult to withdraw these troops along those roads, which are now under the fire control, which can be covered, in other words, by Russian artillery and, of course, as we saw, Russian helicopter gunships. One particular analyst, whose identity I don't know, but who provides summaries of the battlefield summaries every day, and on a channel which calls itself Military Summary, suggested that the Ukrainians might be able to pull their troops out of Lysychansk with their heavy equipment by passing northward, driving through a forest area, and then re-emerging from the forest at a place called Seversky, which is to the rear of the Russian forces and is connected to the Ukrainian military. I have to say, again, always with the caveat that I'm not a military person, that it struck me almost immediately that there was an obvious problem to this strategy, to this attempt to pull the troops out of Lysychansk in that kind of way, and that is that it would require a crossing of the Seversky Donetsk river in an area where there are apparently no bridges, and where there's been attempts both by the Russians and by the Ukrainians to cross the Seversky River in the past without success. You may remember that some weeks ago there were all those pictures of an attempt by the Russians to cross the Seversky River with a pontoon bridge clearly demolished, and with lots of pictures of Russian tanks and armoured vehicles around the crossing, some of which quite clearly looked like they'd been damaged or destroyed in some kind of artillery strike. The exact nature of what happened was never fully cleared up, and it's widely accepted now, I think, that the original estimates of Russian losses were were exaggerated, but there's no doubt at all that the Russians did make various attempts to cross the Seversky River, Donetsk River, in precisely this area, and that was won, and that they were repulsed after coming under artillery attack. Well, this is exactly the same area where it seems to me that the Ukrainians would be trying to escape. They would be trying to escape by crossing the Seversky Donetsk River into this forested area, which is controlled, by the way, by the Russians, in precisely this area where the Russians themselves earlier suffered a debacle. And they would presumably be doing this at night in order to avoid, or at least to reduce, the chances of detection by the Russian military. I have to say that I think that there are obvious problems with this, carrying out a contested river crossing or a river crossing into the enemy-held territory at night in order to escape Lysychansk. I have to say that, I'm not a military person, but it seems to me that the problems with this course are overwhelming. Anyway, that's my view. I'm not going to press the point. I'm not an expert on these things. Maybe that is what the Ukrainians will do. Maybe this is actually a viable idea. But regardless, it's also clear that earlier attempt to pull troops back, either from Lysychansk or from Severodonetsk, it's not entirely clear to me which it is. Even the Ukrainians now accept, by the way, that they were unsuccessful in pulling their troops in Severodonetsk, all of them, back to Lysychansk, and that this was something that failed to be achieved successfully. Most remarkably, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry is now blaming Ukrainian bloggers for supposedly giving away information prematurely about the pullback of these troops from Severodonetsk and from Lysychansk. I have to say that seems to me an extraordinarily low blow, if I may say so, against people of a patriotic nature. If Ukrainian bloggers were able to pick up the fact that the Ukrainians were going to withdraw their troops from particular locations, then inevitably and unavoidably the Russians, with their vastly more sophisticated detection capabilities in this area, would surely also have detected these withdrawals. So it seems to me that for the Ukrainians to blame Ukrainian bloggers for what looks like a debacle only shows the extent of recrimination that must be going on within the Ukrainian command and armed forces, what has clearly turned out to be something of a disaster. So the sum total of all of this is that the Russians captured the Zolotoy-Gorsky encirclement, cauldron, entrapment, call it what you will. They've now captured Severodonetsk. They're now in control of all the area east of the Seversky Donetsk River, and that the only part of Lysychansk that the Ukrainians are still clinging on to, the only part of Lugansk region that the Ukrainians are still clinging on to is Lysychansk, and access to Lysychansk is now becoming increasingly difficult, and it's highly likely that it will be impossible to evacuate those Ukrainian troops in Lysychansk with their heavy equipment. Now, it's been suggested that those troops could withdraw in small dispersed units, presumably under cover of darkness, but that they would have to leave their heavy equipment behind. And it's been suggested that, it's a bad thing to leave tanks and artillery and those kind of things behind you if you're pulling back. And all I would say about that is that in a war, one should always prioritize the lives of one's men, or I would have thought so, over that of equipment. if the Ukrainians are being resupplied with weapon systems by the West. Well, I've expressed my cynicism about that, but Ukraine is always talking about these weapons from the West that are going to come and transform the situation. If the Ukrainians are genuinely believe that they're going to get more weapons supplies from the West, then it ought to be a no-brainer. They should pull their troops out in dispersed numbers and leave their heavy equipment behind and hope that they can carry out that kind of withdrawal under cover of darkness. I have to say that I still think that the most humane and sensible thing to do in this kind of situation is to negotiate the peaceful surrender of Lysychansk and of the military grouping there. But that's not the pattern that the Ukrainians have followed over the course of this war, and I'm sure there'll be people who will argue against that. As I said, if you really want to save the lives of the troops in Lysychansk without and at the same time withdraw them without surrendering to the Russians, then if the only way to do it is in darkness, in small dispersed groups, then do it that way and forget about the heavy equipment. That's how it seems to me. Anyway, it's been, as I said, a day of disaster for Ukraine. They've now lost all the territory east of the Seversky Donetsk river in Lugansk region, in northern Donbas, and it looks like increasingly as if Lysychansk itself is going to become increasingly hard-pressed. And I get to make my own prediction. I think that with this failed evacuation from Lysychansk, if that's what it was, I think that the Ukrainians are going to dig in, and I think they're going to try and make a fight of it in Lysychansk, just as they did in Severodonetsk, which means, unfortunately, that more lives are going to be lost, and all that military equipment that people are worried about, well, that will inevitably and unavoidably at some point fall into Russian hands. Now, as to the timeline for the fall of Lysychansk, I'm not going to make any kind of predictions. As I've said many times, I'm not a military person, and besides, it depends on all sorts of intangibles, the morale of the troops, the ability to keep them resupplied, those sort of things, which I'm not sure that anybody is in a position to assess properly. Anyway, moving on from this, there's a few further points I want to make. Now, as I discussed in my previous program, the Russians have disclosed the name, the identity of the Russian general who's commanding the forces that have just captured Severodonetsk, and it's General Surovikin. And I was interested to see that the British Ministry of Defence is now claiming that he has replaced General Dvornikov as the overall commander in the Donbas war. Now, the British also said that General Surovikin is an officer with a well-known reputation in the Russian army for brutality and corruption. I have no idea where and what the basis of the information that would make General Surovikin into that kind of a person, where that comes from. I'm just going to make one quick observation about this. Some weeks ago, the British claimed that the British and the Americans claimed that General Dvornikov, who is the commander or was the commander of the southern military district of within Russia, had been appointed overall ground forces commander in Donbas. There's never been a Russian announcement to confirm that. And if you follow the Russian communiques, bulletins, statements from the Defense Ministry yesterday about the successful operations in Severodonetsk, it seems to me that General Surovikin is being referred to as the commander of the group of forces south. Now, I'm not sure what group of forces exactly means, but I'm going to guess that it means corps, the equivalent of an American corps, in which case he is a corps commander, not a theatre commander. I don't know whether General Dvornikov was ever the overall commander of Russian forces in Donbas, but it doesn't seem to me as if General Surovikin has in fact replaced him. What this episode shows, yet again, is that the Western powers seem very hazy about the Russian command structure in this war in Ukraine. They don't seem to have a clear idea who the overall commanders are, what the line of command is. Now that's interesting, and it suggests, as I've discussed previously in earlier programs, that the Russians have been able to keep a tight control over their communication systems. I suspect that in the Pentagon they have a pretty shrewd idea who is what the Russian chain of command in Donbas is, but it seems to me as if there's some uncertainty, and that this may explain some of these rather odd statements about generals replacing other generals that we're hearing. The second thing I would say is that we're getting now all kinds of claims, reports from all sorts of people that the Ukrainians carried out a tactical withdrawal, that Severodonetsk has been almost reduced to rubble. By the way, that's not true. I've seen plenty of pictures, and the residential areas of Severodonetsk seem to be largely intact because of the swiftness of the Ukrainian collapse there. But anyway, Severodonetsk supposedly has been reduced to rubble, and the Ukrainians supposedly abandoned this city and withdrew to Lysychansk, which is on higher ground and is therefore more defendable, so that this was somehow a tactical, strategic withdrawal. Well, all I will say about that is that tactical withdrawals do happen in battles, in war, but it seems to me there would have been nothing to prevent the Ukrainians from doing that earlier if Lysychansk was indeed more defendable than Severodonetsk. Then why on earth did they defend Severodonetsk and not concentrate on Lysychansk? On the contrary, as we've seen, they insisted on trying to defend Severodonetsk, and they continue to reinforce their forces there, even though that effectively meant sending more and more Ukrainian troops into a trap. Now, the other thing is, I talk about tactical withdrawals. We had a spectacular example of a very orderly tactical or strategic withdrawal earlier in the war. That was the one that the Russians carried out at the end of March and the beginning of April, when they pulled back from their troops from outside Kiev, Sumy, and Chernigov. And they were able to carry out that withdrawal, keeping all their forces intact, preserving all their military equipment, without any particular sign that things were breaking down in any particular way, and despite the fact that they were doing so ahead of a hostile army. That, it seems to me, is a case study in how a genuine tactical or strategic withdrawal is carried out. This kind of tactical strategic withdrawal that we're seeing in Severodonetsk is no such thing. It's a rout. And I think that there is a fundamental difference between the two. And if you look at the one and compare it with the other, you can see how different the two things are. The Ukrainians had the option of pulling back from Severodonetsk and indeed from Lysychansk earlier in the war. They could have done it a few weeks ago. They could have done it in the same orderly way that we saw the Russian army do when it pulled back from Kiev and other places, but they threw away that opportunity. And in fact, I suspect that what we're going to see is more bitter resistance by the Ukrainians in this part of Donbas. And in fact, there's reports already circulating that instead of the Ukrainians pulling back from northern Donbas, they're actually trying to rush more of their reserve troops there in order to plug more gaps in their lines, depleting their available trained manpower even more. And lastly, I should say that one Ukrainian officer gave an interview yesterday to Sky News in Britain in which he admitted that 80% of his best troops, his most professional troops, the troops that he'd built up into a team since 2018, that they've all been killed and wounded and are therefore no longer able to continue in the war. So it looks to me as if more troops like that are going to be thrown away, trying to plug gaps in the line, a line which cannot hold. But that's the strategy the Ukrainians have followed throughout the war. So it's not just, the war of course isn't just confined to Donbas. There's been more Russian missile strikes in other places, more Russian advances ever closer to Kharkiv, more talk about a Russian operation, some sort of big Russian operation being planned at Kharkiv. If you believe Russian reports of their missile strikes, the last couple of hours have seen hundreds more of Ukrainian soldiers being killed. There was reports of another barracks being attacked with lots of Ukrainian soldiers killed there, hundreds of them. I'm not in a position to corroborate any of that. It wouldn't surprise me if it's true, but then again, that only comes from the Russian side. So, we mustn't assume that it is true. But regardless of that, clearly a debacle, a clear-cut defeat in Severodonetsk, and those who are trying to rationalize it, to spin it into something else, are, it seems to me, exposing their lack of realism about the direction of events in this war. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon, though I'm not quite sure how soon. And thank you for joining me again today. Remember, you can find us on Locals and Rumble and other platforms. You can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can go to our shop. And last but not least, please don't forget to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this video.